NASA's Watchdog flagged a 171-foot lunar lander with a crew elevator positioned roughly 115 feet above the moon's surface. But the elevator is not the real issue. The real issue is the chain of dependencies built around it. And if one part of that chain fails during a mission, the current Artemis architecture does not require a rescue fallback. On March 10, 2026, NASA's Office of Inspector General released a report titled NASA's Management of the Human Landing System Contracts. The report was not written to criticize one visible design feature. It was written to assess how risk is distributed across the landing architecture. And what it reveals is a concentration of unresolved dependencies within a single crewed lunar landing architecture. In this analysis, we break down the risk chain exposed in NASA's report and explain why the elevator is only the most visible part of that chain. The OIG report highlights multiple unresolved dependencies in Starship's human landing system design. The most visible is the vehicle's height. At 171 feet, Starship HLS is significantly taller than any lunar lander used in previous human missions. Apollo-era landers were much smaller, and astronauts could step directly onto the surface. But with Starship HLS, astronauts must descend from roughly 115 feet above the lunar surface. That requires an elevator for routine crew access. The elevator is a critical system, but it is also the clearest entry point into a broader set of operational dependencies. Once a crewed lunar architecture depends on that elevator, the surrounding systems matter more. Landing stability matters more, surface operations matter more, manual control matters more, test representativeness matters more, and rescue planning matters more. The first link in the chain is landing stability. Starship HLS is expected to operate in the lunar South Pole region. That region is valuable, but the terrain is challenging. The OIG report notes that slopes there can reach up to 20 degrees. At the same time, NASA's tolerance for safe crew operations after landing is approximately 8 degrees of tilt. That gap matters. A taller vehicle is more sensitive to uneven terrain. A small angle at the base becomes a larger displacement at the top. Height is not just a visual detail, it is a multiplier. It affects touchdown stability. It affects the degree of tilt the crew experiences after landing. And it affects whether post-landing operations remain inside NASA's tolerance window. That makes landing stability the first major operational dependency in the chain. The second dependency is access. The elevator is positioned roughly 115 feet above the lunar surface. The OIG report states that at the time of writing, there was no alternate method for the crew to re-enter the vehicle from the lunar surface in the event of elevator failure. The report also notes that NASA's HLS program is working with SpaceX on alternate means of ingress. Now that distinction matters. This is a current state risk, not a claim that no alternative can ever exist. But until those alternatives are fully tested and integrated, elevator failure remains a crew-critical access dependency. The elevator is not just a convenience feature. And the architecture NASA is reviewing, the ability to return the crew from the lunar surface to the vehicle is directly tied to it. The third dependency is manual control. NASA requires astronauts to be able to manually control the vehicle during all phases of flight, especially descent and landing. This is not a preference. It is part of the human rating requirements. The OIG report states that NASA and SpaceX have not fully aligned on whether the current approach meets the intent of that requirement. NASA's internal tracking also shows that the trend for this risk has been worsening. Now that matters because manual intervention is part of NASA's definition of crew authority during critical flight phases. If the manual control approach does not meet NASA's human rating intent, the unresolved gap carries over into the crewed architecture, and that raises the burden on certification, oversight, and contingency planning. The fourth dependency is the test like you fly gap. NASA follows a basic principle in crewed spaceflight. The system you test should closely resemble the system you plan to fly, but the OIG report notes that NASA did not require the uncrewed demonstration of Starship HLS to include several key crew systems, including life support, airlocks, and the elevator. As a result, the demo vehicle will not fully represent the mass or configuration of the crewed vehicle. A lighter vehicle requires fewer tanker launches for refueling. Fewer tanker launches reduce the complexity of the demonstration, but they also mean that the full propellant aggregation process will not be tested under the same conditions as a crewed mission. That is the gap. The demonstration may still prove important things, but it may not prove the full system under crew representative conditions. And that means key operational dependencies may remain insufficiently exercised before astronauts rely on them. 4 dependencies are already visible in the architecture that NASA is assessing, but there is a 5th, and it changes the meaning of the rest. If you value this kind of systems-level analysis, subscribe, because once rescue is not a required fallback, the earlier gaps no longer sit in isolation. The 5th dependency is rescue fallback. The OIG report states that NASA has not required an in-space crew rescue capability for Artemis missions. If the human landing system becomes disabled on the lunar surface, or if it cannot return to Orion or Gateway in near rectilinear halo orbit, the absence of rescue capability raises the stakes of every earlier unresolved dependency. Now that changes the meaning of the whole chain. Landing stability is no longer just a terrain management problem. Access is no longer just a mechanical dependency. Manual control is no longer just a certification question. Test representativeness is no longer just a development issue, because the mission architecture does not require a rescue fallback. Every earlier gap carries greater weight within the crewed architecture. This does not mean Starship HLS cannot work, and it does not mean that one visible subsystem automatically invalidates the entire architecture. The point is narrower and more specific. NASA's oversight report describes a crewed lunar landing architecture in which multiple unresolved dependencies are concentrated within a single system. Apollo-era landers were smaller, lower, and simpler in how astronauts access the surface. Astronauts could step down and return without relying on a high-elevation ingress system. Starship HLS offers a different kind of architecture. In theory, it provides greater payload potential, a longer planned surface duration, and greater operational flexibility. But that capability comes with added complexity. Height increases landing sensitivity, the elevator creates an access dependency, orbital refueling adds sequencing and aggregation risk, and each added layer increases the burden on the architecture as a whole. That broader program context also matters. By March 2026, Artemis was already being revised. The OIG report was issued within a program that was no longer static, raising the stakes for unresolved HLS dependencies. This does not make the report a broad indictment of Artemis, but it does make one point harder to ignore. The lander-dependent portion of the architecture still carries unresolved risk, while the larger campaign is under active revision. The issue lies in how risk is distributed across the system. If one link in the chain fails, the current architecture does not require a rescue fallback. The OIG report raises the question of whether these dependencies can be sufficiently closed before astronauts rely on the system. If the uncrewed demo does not fully represent the crewed vehicle and no rescue fallback is required, those gaps remain inside the crewed architecture. This is not just a technical question, it is a systems-level question. The elevator is not the problem by itself. The height is not the problem by itself. The problem is that landing stability, surface access, manual control, test representativeness, and rescue planning are all connected. And when those dependencies remain unresolved within a single crewed architecture, they no longer behave like isolated problems. That is the report's real significance. If the uncrewed demo is not fully representative of the crewed vehicle and no rescue fallback is required for the early Artemis missions, how much of the lunar landing architecture is being validated before astronauts depend on it?